Welcome to Healthy Living, your health awareness show on Afro Worldview, the show that keeps you informed with all your health-related matters. My name is Ronald Avaji, and today we tackle drug awareness, the scourge that's plaguing our society. Let's check out what we have in store for you on the show. Clinical psychologist Bradley Daniels gives his expert opinion on drug usage and addiction, while Brett Dolling shares his journey of using drugs, and we close off with an easy fitness routine. South Africa is battling not only the scourge of certain uniquely South African illicit street drugs, such as Nyaupe, but also the increasing abuse of legal medications, such as ARVs, painkillers and cough syrup, leading to what has been called silent addictions. Clinical psychologist Bradley shares more. Bradley, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. When we look at addiction that people deal with, whether it be alcohol, sex addiction, whether it be drug addiction, or to anything else, does it boil down to something as simple as a bad habit that has formed?
Ronald, I don't think we can look at it as just a bad habit that is formed. What we find normally where people are challenged with addiction, it normally has to do with several other things. And some of them could be things such as a lack of self-esteem. So usually there's a very low self-esteem associated with people who suffer from addiction as well. And then we can also find that there's other comorbidities. So there could be other psychological problems such as depression or anxiety. And usually people have learned the use of one or other substance to be able to subvert or almost to sort of self-medicate, if we can call it that. So no, the problem is never as simple as just a formulation of bad habits.
But when we look at it, does addiction affect us psychologically and or physiologically?
Well, we definitely know that addiction affects people physiological. So depending on the substrate or the substance that people are abused to, it will have an impact on their physiological makeup, if we can call. So things such as alcohol or other drugs will have a direct impact on the wellness of the body. But that's not the only part of it. The other part is also the psychosocial implications of addiction. So for example, what we find for someone to be classified as having a problem with addiction, we must say that the use of the substance is causing them significant distress and change in their daily activities of living, in their ability to perform their jobs, and basically just to function in society. Then we would say that the problem is classified as an addiction problem. And these problems will normally have a devastating impact on the overall life and quality of life of the person. So not just physiologically, but also socially and also in terms of the occupational space.
But I love what you said there, because this impacts others around that person that is living with this addiction. Because when you look at the personal space, it's at the direct impact, and depending on the addiction, it becomes family dynamic issues, children that get affected, but then on the occupational side, it affects your income. So what happens is you as an individual living with this addiction are faced with a paradigm of being selfish versus am I having an impact on others? And does that impact the rehabilitation potential of that individual?
Well, we first have to take a step back and say that it's not just as simple as saying that the person that's suffering from addiction is just purely selfish and that they are not aware of the consequences in terms of what's happening with their family or at work or those kinds of things. What is important here is that we need to understand that addiction or people that suffer from addiction, actually, we say clinically that the brain is also impacted. So the structure of the brain is such that there's certain behavior patterns become associated with addiction. So we'll get, for example, the repetitive actions and the bad habits that you talk about, which people keep falling into, even though they know that the consequences are more devastating than the actual good that they're deriving from the use of the substance or the drug for that matter. But it almost seems like they're unable to stop the usage. And if we look at more sort of neurological understanding of what's happening, we find that the brain becomes repetitive in terms of it gets the person to repeat the same behavior over and over, irrespective of the negative consequences that come thereof. So I think it would be very short-sighted of us to say that it is just a case of the person suffering from addiction being selfish or being self-absorbed. But it's more often what we find that people often have poor coping skills for coping with, stresses in their lives, or very ordinary stresses for some, and for some more adverse, but people are challenged in terms of coming up with more functional coping mechanisms in order to work through the problem. So they often turn to the drug, not only for the pleasure, but also for the form of escapism it gives them from the problems or challenges that they have.
And what is the ability to rehabilitate this person, to wean them off whatever they're addicted to? Because it has an impact, as you mentioned, psychosocially, occupational-wise, and personally. But how do we then Do we have to, as an outsider, say to them, you know, we notice a problem, or do they have to own it for themselves and then come out? And what is the success rate of rehabilitation?
So, in terms of rehabilitation, it can be quite a complex model that one has to follow, because it's not that easy to get somebody who's challenged with addiction to go to sort of sign up for a rehab facility or anything of that nature. So usually, unfortunately, we normally have to start with the person must be ready to make a change in their life. So that motivation needs to be there for the person to bring about the change of behavior in the first place. And without that motivation, it becomes very difficult to get the person into a rehab. Now, some of the common talks that we hear, or language that we hear in the sort of addiction space, is around saying that people have to, or family members and others and friends have to practice what's called a tough love approach. Now, what this is about is around that the addict needs to start to come to terms with the consequences of their behavior. And unfortunately, it may be very difficult to observe and to witness as a loved one or a family member or even a work colleague. But often it is found that only once people hit that point do they become ready to be able to make the changes. Now, that doesn't mean that we just sort of observe and watch the situation unfold. As part of what we need to do as the support structure or the surrounding structure in the system is to be able to provide support in the sense of, one, encouraging the person to go to rehab, but at the same time also making it clear to them that there are consequences for them not going to rehab. And we thus sort of hope to kind of like spur the process along for the person to actually be ready and willing and motivated to enter rehab. Now, another thing which is important as well is that if somebody is actively using, it's very difficult in a therapeutic space to actually do very life-changing work with them at that point. So it's important that people then first detox from whatever substance it is that they're using. So for example, with alcohol or any other form of drug, that they first get into a process where they are detoxing in a very controlled environment, such as what a rehab facility can provide. And thereafter, we can start working at changing some of the sort of like habits that we've spoken about, changing some of the issues they have around perhaps self-esteem, dealing with the comorbidities such as anxiety or depression or anything else that goes with it. And that will lead to a more probable sense of success in that particular sort of intervention.
When we look at it from a perspective of once you've gone through the rehab process and you've beaten that addiction, whatever it may be, in this phase of your life, are you cured forever, or will that bug always have the ability to bite? So it's a consistent awareness within that individual.
So one of the things that we often hear being referred to in the addiction space is people refer to themselves as recovering addicts. And reason why that sort of thinking came about is around the fact that addiction is an illness, and so people make a recovery from it, but the recovery continues on a daily basis. Even if they have stepped out of a rehabilitation process, they thereafter are still continuing to recover, and often there's a lot of consolidation that is needed after even an inpatient treatment program. And often people have this idea that once you go into an inpatient treatment facility, when you exit the treatment facility, that the whole challenge has been solved. And that is not the case, because it's important that people have support outside once they've been sort of discharged or they finished an inpatient treatment program. And it's also important that family members continue to support, and it can often be a continuously challenging journey for the person suffering from addiction. However, people also start to see in the recovery process some of the benefits that comes from them not using or not being sort of enslaved by the addiction.
I think it's a very key point, because it's important for that person dealing with the addiction and facing those demons that they have to deal with. However, the impact, as you mentioned, on the family, in theory it's great to say keep on supporting, but when is enough enough? Are they stealing from the house? Are they putting you at risk? Are they putting your kids at risk, or other brothers and sisters at risk as well? When do you draw that line? And when is tough love an option, but what is beyond that? Because some families just throw their hands up and don't know what to do anymore.
I think often families usually are left with a feeling of not really knowing what to do going further. And I think the effects of many different things unfolding in the family, as you said, the stealing of goods from the house to pay for a particular habit, that's some of the things that we see. As well as sometimes there can be, abuse that comes from the person being intoxicated and sort of interacting with the family. So the harmful effects are often clearly seen. And I think what is important is that in the treatment process, we also look at it systemically. So we try to support the family in terms of strengthening their own coping methodologies or coping abilities to be able to deal with the problem and also to come up with new solutions to the problem. So we often say we try to treat the problem systemically by treating the entire system, and hopefully the person that is challenged by the addiction will in such a way be compelled to start making the changes to change the behavior and to change how they sort of behave in their life with regards to addiction or the use of substances.
You know, let me flip the coin now. We've spoken a lot about the addiction and the impact it has and the journey to recovery, not just for the individual, but also for those that are surrounded by that individual, both work and at home. But what about developing good habits? Is it a difficult process? Is it a process that becomes a distraction from not dealing with what you should be able to do that takes you onto the addiction path? What do we need to do to implement to build a good habit into our lifestyles?
Well, I would say the first thing around, the first good habit I think that is essential to dealing with addiction is that the person needs to develop an insight into self. And the insight into self has to do with firstly building their own self-awareness, which then in turn will build their own self-esteem, which then when people have a better self-esteem, they're less likely to succumb to the pressures of substance abuse. And so in a way what we're actually saying, psychologically, it's important that the person actually gets almost developed and built through a psychotherapeutic process to be able to have a better understanding of themselves. And some of that understanding with regards to why it is that they turn to something like alcohol or drugs or any other substrate for that matter. So in essence, the first thing is around helping the person to gain better self-insight and self-awareness, which will then improve their self-esteem, which makes it less likely for them to fall into the challenge with addiction. So I would say that's the first place that we would start with.
Wow, that's great to know. I think a starting point for everybody. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing this amazing insight with us and joining us once again in studio right here on Healthy Living.
Thank you for having me, Ronald.
Understanding how drug addiction affects not only the individual but your family is an important thing when it comes to rehabilitation. It's now time to see what we have in store for you in Health News.
In your health news, scientists from University College London believe that even a slightly raised blood pressure over a long period of time can damage the brain. The findings underline just prove how important it is for middle-aged adults to get their health in order. About a third of adults have high blood pressure, and it is linked to drinking, being overweight, smoking, and eating too much salt. Out of South Africa's population of 56 million people, only about 1% donate blood regularly. This blood is used across the country to people who need a transfusion during an operation or after being involved in an accident. While the South African National Blood Service applauds its regular donors, more volunteers are needed to ensure the target of 3,300 units per day is maintained. In South Africa, there are 23 suicides a day recorded and 230 serious attempts. According to South African Depression Anxiety Group, these alarming figures indicate that we have quite a sick community in the country, and these suicide incidents could relate to crime and violence-based activities and might be linked to depression. Medical advances seem to be happening in a blink of an eye. New British scientists report that they have created human corneas using 3D printing technology. The researchers said they hope this breakthrough will one day ensure an unlimited supply of corneas. Human corneas are now in short supply.
Stay tuned. After the break, we speak to Brett, who works with drug abusers.